Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Welcome, listeners, to Extrology, the space where extraordinary stories illuminate our quest for personal growth and resilience, amongst many other things. Today, we're setting sail into the heart of adventure with Mark Agnew, a man whose life is a testament to the spirit of exploration and the pursuit of the extraordinary. Mark, alongside his three teammates, embarked on an unprecedented journey, becoming the first people to kayak the entire Northwest Passage. This 103-day expedition not only captivated the British public, but also underscored the power of experience, camaraderie, and the profound impact of setting colossal goals. An adventurer, speaker, journalist, and advocate for the great outdoors, Mark founded the outdoor and extreme sports section in the South China Morning Post, setting a global benchmark for adventure journalism. His adventures, both near and far, are not just about the thrill. They're about the lessons learned, the resilience built, and the joy found in both the journey and its challenges. From close encounters with polar bears to advocating for stay ventures that resonate with environmental stewardship and personal discovery, Mark's narrative is one of inspiration, determination, and a deep-seated belief in the power of setting goals. Mark's adventures raise funds for noble causes like the Wilderness Foundation UK, highlighting his commitment to not just exploring the world, but also giving back to it. Join us as we delve into Mark's world, exploring the essence of adventure, resilience, and the philosophy that drives him to continuously seek the horizon. We uncover how Mark's extraordinary journeys can inspire us to lead happier, healthier lives, both in our personal and professional endeavours. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Mark Agnew, welcome to Extrology. Great to have you here as my guest today. Fascinated by your story. I've got so many things I want to ask, but I guess firstly, politely, welcome. How are you? How's your day? Off mic, we've kind of gotten into the joys of being the father of two little ones, so which will create those challenges. But I hope you're well, and really looking forward to getting stuck into this today.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's been a good day. It's sunny, so the fingers of spring seem to be breaking through, and yeah, fatherhood's sort of ticking along. I can hear my wife downstairs with a crying baby, so I hope she's all right as I'm chatting about myself again. So that's the norm these days.
Well, we'll get onto the subject of a good support crew in due course, and I think that's probably an integral part of it. But nonetheless, let's start with completing the Northwest Passage by kayak. It's, by any measure, an extraordinary feat. I think my question is, can you share what motivated you and your team to take on such a monumental challenge? But I think also within that, we need to have a bit of context to explain to listeners who may not be familiar as to what the Northwest Passage might be, and therefore the scale and magnitude of the task and challenge that you decided to undertake.
Yes, what is the Northwest Passage and why did it hold such a place in my imagination? Well, it's the Arctic route that links the Atlantic to the Pacific. And Britain became obsessed with it because they thought it would be a shortcut for trade to Asia. Back in the 16th century, they couldn't go around South America to get to Asia because that was owned by Spain. They couldn't go around the tip of Africa because that was owned by the Dutch. And maybe they could go over North America. And they didn't get very far because it was full of ice. But nonetheless, they became obsessed with it. And by the 19th century, there were dozens of explorers going up there all trying to link this waterway as a shortcut. And it became sort of adventure rather than trade, even though the guise was trade, because clearly it wasn't a viable trade route, even if they found the links and the waterways and the passages and the gaps between the islands. It wasn't like a shortcut. It was taking people years just to get in and out because it would freeze around them. And the most famous guy was John Franklin, who you might have seen in the BBC series The Terror, or Michael Palin's book, The Erebus, which was a bestseller a couple of years ago. They disappeared there, and later they found out that they'd been trapped by ice and that they all ate each other as they had a desperate bid to survive. And their boats were only found, I think, 2016 and 2012, or 2016 and around, recently. And we've been looking for them for a while. And it's not that deep. At low tide, you could see the mast sometimes. So that's how remote and wild this place is. A ship that we were looking for that is visible during low tide took almost 200 years to find.
I mean, it's a vast expanse as well, isn't it? I mean, it's almost incomprehensible to try and wrap your head around how vast the landscape might be. It's just a huge expanse of tundra. Is that how we would define it?
Well, it's very varied.
Frozen tundra.
It was very varied. It surprised me how varied it was from like a topographical point of view. And there are Inuit who live up there and have lived up there for millennia. And in the second half of our journey in particular, there were like signs of humanity. We stopped in an Inuit community halfway. There was another place called Puglatuk and Kuglatuk. I might be pronouncing them wrong. And we were aiming for a place called Tuktoyaktuk. So there was places we could have gone in the second half. The first half did feel very, very wild. And I don't know why it took so long to find the Terror and the Erebus, because we knew they'd sunk somewhere in King William Island. So even if the place is big and vast, there was just one island to look for them on. But I think it was perhaps Western arrogance that wasn't listening to the Inuit tales and the Inuit who were pointing exactly to where it was. And we ignored them. But I mean, he's the guy who's famous. People often think he found the Northwest Passage, but he didn't. He just died trying to find it. He went 3 times, and the first time he became famous because he ran out of food and ate his own boots. And then on the last time he became famous because he didn't come back. But fast forward to now, and the difference between John Franklin and me is that the ice is disappearing. So even when somebody did finally make it all the way through the Northwest Passage, it was found in the 1850s by a guy called John Ray. And then it was navigated by Roald Amundsen, who's more famous for being the first person to the South Pole. And even he took 3 years because he knew where he was going. He wasn't exploring, he was adventuring. And he would make it forward and then get frozen in by the sea ice and turn his ship into a camp and wait for the next window almost a year later and creep his way through. And then fast forward from there, which was 1906, to now, the ice is disappearing for long enough that maybe somebody could do it with human power without a motor or sail, all in one go. So that was something that sort of swirled around the adventure community's imagination. And since 2013, people have been trying it, either rowboats, canoes, kayaks, hybrids, different versions, to try and be the first people to do it under human power in a single go. And even this year, when we were trying it, there were 2 other rowing teams, one going from the same end as us and one going from the other end. And those 2 didn't make it. I'm sure they had great adventures nonetheless, but we did. We became the first to do it by kayak, first to do it by human power with no motors or sails in a single season. And it was an absolutely fantastic experience.
Do you remember a time at which that sort of intrigue and I want to say turned on, seems like the right right expression to use, but when were you first turned on to the idea of the Northwest Passage as a destination for adventure, first and foremost?
Well, I was obsessed reading like polar stories, the likes of Shackleton and others. So I would have, loved to emulate them or, experience what they experienced and that kind of thing as a young man. And then simultaneously, I read a book called The Man Who Ate His Boots about John Franklin, but more broadly about the Northwest Passage. The title was specifically about Franklin. And I saw an ocean rower who posted something saying that he wanted to be the first person to row the whole Northwest Passage. And that, in my mind, I was like, well, this is my chance to do what they did, to do a genuine first, something that is like, I feel like there's a lot of firsts which are difficult and challenging, and the adventure is impressive, but the actual concept of the first is partly just because they're the first people to think of it. But this is like a first that's rooted in history, so it caught my imagination. And I think that my narrative around that maybe chilled out a little bit. Initially, I was calling it like the last great first. And I think growing up, re-examining why I wanted to be an adventurer, the conversations around Black Lives Matter and other wider social conversations, I began to question whether it's the last great first. And, people live there, Inuit live there. They might have a more nuanced relationship with the explorers who went there previously. So, I was still excited about it as a first. And I was definitely inspired by those stories that I'd read. It wasn't like I just woke up one day and was so woke that I detested those stories, but I definitely had a more nuanced idea of what we were doing and what motivated me.
Do you have, I guess for context for listeners and understanding, do you have a sense as to when that spirit of adventure, if you like, became, where does it stem from? Do you have sort of early childhood memories as to, thinking, exploring and exploration and adventure is something you're fascinated by? And at what point, I'm clearly butchering the whole podcast premise, asking countless questions in one, but nonetheless, it's kind of, I'm fascinated to understand, where did it stem from? And was there a point at which you thought there's a career in it? There's something that this could become?
So I guess the motivations, the seeds of adventure were multifaceted. My dad's an explorer. He mapped part of South America. He climbed unclimbed peaks in Greenland in the 60s and 70s. My mum's an adventurer. She traveled overland back from Australia over 4 or 5 years in the 70s as a young woman in her 20s. It was like an amazing adventure. I was often outdoors, hiking, camping holidays, the like. So they were all like seeds planted. But as a kid, or certainly as a teenager, I was just interested in rugby. And so there was no like serious outdoorsiness beyond like recreational. And then I went to Hong Kong initially to play rugby. I got a job as an adventure sports journalist. And the adventure scene, the outdoor scene in Hong Kong is massive. It's like 40% of the country is these big national parks with big mountains, huge ultra running community. So rather than just the occasional hike when I'm free, it was like hiking Saturday, Sunday after work, got into coastal rowing, that kind of thing. And then the adventure sports journalism job, where I was exposed to more and more people doing different adventures. That was something that super drived it. Equally, just after I left university, 2013, I got a message from a friend who wanted to row the Atlantic. It took us a few years to attempt that. I was in Hong Kong by the time we actually tried and failed. But that was also like a big moment between, I'd love to, cycle here or hike there, to let's do something big. And that's what I thought the biggest thing possible was at the time. But now I've like delved into the world and I'm realizing like the different things you can do and the imagination that you can apply to doing something unique and all of those things. So there's no easy answer. There's not like, I read this book and I suddenly decided that I was going to do it. In terms of career, I love storytelling. I wanted to be a journalist. I now give talks to companies, sharing, sometimes just entertaining stories, but sometimes lessons about the resilience it required, etc., with psychology applied. But if it wasn't this, then I probably would have tried to be a stand-up comedian. I just love public speaking, So it's that's where the career aspects come from.
I've had a guest on actually who I should introduce you, should connect you with, who's been a stand-up comedian, and actually we had this fascinating conversation around what it takes to stand up and try and make a room full of people laugh, and this whole conversation around fear and resilience and feeling that fear and leaning into it and getting out of your comfort zone. And I fascinating story, great guy as well.
Yeah.
So
my talk is primarily funny, I would say. I think people are coming in there seeing a big bearded white man who's on a world first in the Arctic, expecting me to be like, oh, I'm so hard, we overcame this, but it is immediately self-deprecating and funny. Hopefully, people laugh back at it. So that's the idea.
I think you make an interesting point as to the place that humour has to play in resilience, and actually how we use humour as a tool through which to, as a coping mechanism oftentimes.
Yeah. There's lots of we laughed at ourselves and kept going kind of moments.
I can imagine we're going to explore some of those. So you've got enough of an idea. I know we're going to kayak the Northwest Passage. How do you make that happen?
So that guy who posted about rowing the Northwest Passage initially, the one that sort of sparked an idea, is like, wow, this is a thing. I initially paired up with him, and he organizes ocean rowing expeditions, and it was sort of like a pay per place, I guess, like a semi-guide. But late on, I switched to a kayaking team who were our rivals before. I mean, one would be the first to kayak it. The others would be the first to row it in a single season. Somebody else had already rowed it over multiple years. And we'd added each other on Facebook, wishing each other good luck. But wink, wink, I hope you come second kind of thing. But I messaged them very late in the day saying, I think I'd be happier on your team. Have you got a space? And because I knew they did. They transferred from singles, having attempted it in 2022 and not got very far, to doubles in the hope that the tandems would solve some of the problems they'd had. and which opened up a spot. And lo and behold, they accepted me on, and I went, and it was really a very fantastic experience, a good decision retrospectively. So, like my road even to this team was convoluted. I mean, to the extent that when I flew to the Arctic to kayak the Northwest Passage, it was the first time I'd met them.
Goodness. I'm sat here struck by how you build camaraderie and teamwork and, shared purpose, common goal. All of these things are going through my head, how you build that stuff over a period of time, training sessions, whatever it might be. But you're saying the first time you met them was literally, right, guys, come on, let's go.
Yes. Well, I guess to that team cohesion point, one thing that I have learned previously is like there is nothing like the real thing. There's nothing like it. Even if you are sleep deprived for 3 days, you know that you're coming home on a Friday. And I'm not saying don't train. You've got to train. You've got to prepare. And ideally, we would have had a lot of kayaking under our belt as a team. But equally, like sometimes people seem like the most prepared person in the world. And then when the like enormity sinks in after like a week or 5 days, and you think, this is 5 days out of 60 or 100 or whatever, or indefinitely, that is the training mentally or the camaraderie or the cohesion or everything you built before is of course relevant. But so I don't think sometimes it's that relevant. I can't believe you guys didn't kayak together. Okay, well, let's say we had kayak together for a day or two, would that have been relevant on day 10 when I work out that this annoys me about that guy and this annoys me about that guy? It's just such a different experience. It's so vast, so much more vast that the only real thing is the real thing. Nonetheless, I would have definitely liked to train with them. I just couldn't afford to fly to America. They were all American and spend time with them, unfortunately. So, yeah, when you're talking about cohesion, this is one of the psychologists I called beforehand and spoke to was a guy who studies cohesion in military units. I asked him about it, particularly as I hadn't met them. And he says there's two kinds of cohesion: social cohesion and task cohesion. Social cohesion is how well a group gets along. Task cohesion is how likely they are to fulfill a task. We might have been best friends and had no idea to kayak. We might have been ultra kayak champions and hated each other. But I think that they intertwine. The more you like each other, the more likely you are to push yourself hard and achieve the goal. And we could even see that in the team dynamics. Days when we were stuck on shore for a few days at a time with a storm raging around us, like counting the days until we ran out of time or ran out of food or winter arrived. Our task cohesion was completely inhibited by stuff outside our control. And of course, everybody would get stressed and the social cohesion would suffer. And then as soon as we started taking strokes, everybody's best friends again. So you can see how they interact. But I think at the base of that, people think, you've got to get along. You've got to be best friends. Like before you go on, you've got to trust somebody like this. But I think the base of it is actually the other way around. The task cohesion builds the social cohesion. And no matter what happened, no matter our lack of time together or the fact that they're Texan in their 60s or from Alaska in their 50s and I'm British and in my 30s, no matter these cultural or generational or geographical differences, we shared an absolute iron will to get this done. We never said, hey guys, should we talk about like a cutoff date or an exit plan? Even though that probably would have been a sensible discussion to have. Like at the end, when we were clawing to the end, we never entered anybody's mind. And that task cohesion meant that like the social cohesion was there too, because at the end of the day, that's what we had in common. And even if we have nothing else in common, we can have a beer in like a week, a year, or 10 years and just know that like that is what we shared. So I think the two are interlinked, but first and foremost, it's task cohesion. Because I guess I'm almost rambling now, but the other side, I've done a rowing trip with somebody who's a great person, huge personality, charismatic, funny stories, really looking forward to it. Such a core part of my motivation is like the shared experience. So I couldn't be more excited than doing it with somebody like this. And they just turn out to be rubbish at rowing. And after a couple of days, those funny anecdotes begin to like grate. They're not funny anymore. They're like, okay, shut up and row, blah, blah, blah. You got to do the task before you do the social. So, first and foremost, it's a task and everything else builds off that. And we just shared this iron will and like all brought different things to the team and whatnot. But I look back on those like just hardy guys and girls and what they did. I mean, Jeff, for example, completely severed his Achilles tendon about a third of the way through and just finished.
I mean, for the benefit of those that, are clearly, I'm pulling a face, which is never a good premise for a podcast, but nonetheless, I'm just stunned. He severed his Achilles and continued.
Yeah. He was hobbling around for all of it with like a very tight Achilles. And then he stood on some mud, so his heel dropped down. And he said he heard the pop travel up his dry suit, out of the dry suit into his ears. And then we didn't take his boot off for I can't remember now, like either hours or maybe a couple of days, partly because he didn't want to look at it, and partly because now there was no tension holding his heel in place. If you pulled the shoe, his foot just came with it. And so we had to like maneuver his shoe off, and then there was just a gap where you could just visibly see it and then squidge it where the two ends of his Achilles should have met. And maybe if we were in solo kayaks, I don't know, I can't speak for Jeff, but he might have considered getting off, because then the three of us could have gone on. But in two double kayaks, if somebody gets off, somebody else has to get off. And he just, he's a very, very hard man. And like, it was just talked about every now and then again, but it was never really like, I would have complained about it at least a little bit.
Remarkable. So how far is it? It's a 103 day expedition, but how many Ks, how many miles? For context, how far is it?
So it was about 1,800 miles. The Northwest Passage was about 1,600 miles, but we had to kayak a little bit to get to the start and to the end, because we were going by the definitions of the Canadian government and the Hydrographic Society and where they mapped it, and they get very specific latitudes of when you enter the archipelago and when you exit the archipelago, and there's not anything there. There's not like, here's the Northwest Passage, please pick up your baggage on the right. So we had to kayak to it and from it. So 1,800 miles, I guess, and then 1,600 of the actual Northwest Passage. And it took us 3 weeks to get into the Northwest Passage.
Goodness me. So let's talk about some of the challenges, of which I'm sure there were numerous, not least of which a man with a missing Achilles would have been part of the challenge, or severed Achilles. But you trapped in sea ice, encountering polar bears. I mean, the list goes on. How did those? Well, first and foremost, let's talk about some of those challenges, and I'm interested to understand how those challenges test and ultimately, you think, strengthen your resilience.
Well, the sea ice was like the big thing in the beginning. The first 100 miles was beset by sea ice, and we frequently did kayak 40 miles a day. So 100 miles could have taken us 3 days, but we got immediately repelled by the sea ice, trapped in the sea ice, made it back to a cabin, and then stuck there for 15 days. And so those first 100 miles took days and days, and that was before we'd even entered the Northwest Passage. And I guess the way that tests resilience is uncertainty. It's uncertainty. When are we going to get going? Will we get going? What's going to happen when we get going? Is this just going to happen again and again, and we're only going to make it 200 miles in 6 months? So that's one way. Another way is uncertainty while you're actually doing it. We launched that first day and tried to skirt our way along the ice pack with the idea of then kayaking back through it and landing on shore and camping. And it shifted while we were out there. So we decided to turn tail, go back to the cabins, wait. And that was the beginning of our 2-week wait. But as we turned around, the pack had already shifted. So our route back to land that we'd come from was now no longer existent. And the fog came in, like thick pea soup fog. And with the ice and the grey water and the grey air from the fog, perspective just became utterly bamboozling. And I'd frequently see something and think, wow, there's a cliff a couple of miles away, nothing between me and it. We've done it. We found the end of the pack. We're about to be back at land. And then my eyes would focus. I'd realize that it was just like a piece of ice, 3 meters high, maybe 10 meters away. And that kept on happening. And because we couldn't see land because of the fog, and obviously this pack ice isn't on a map. So on our GPS, we knew that we'd passed the land already. And even when we got around the pack, we would be landing on more ice, but more permanent ice, fast ice. So the uncertainty of just not having a finish line, like other days would be like, let's go 40 miles today. And right, we've got 5 miles to go. If I push myself a little bit harder, then the day will end quicker. Or I can see the end, just land there. Finish lines are like, great, but this is indefinite. It could have been 2 hours. It could have been 30 hours before we had any hope of making it to land. And that requires a great deal of resilience to deal with the lack of finish line. Because the mind thrives off finish lines and it holds your body together for finish lines. I read a book called Endure by Alex Hutchison, and he opens the book with the question, when marathon runners collapse over the finish line, have they timed it so perfectly? Have they paced themselves so perfectly that they don't have an ounce of energy left at exactly the finish line? Had the finish line accidentally been put 300 meters further down the line, would they collapse 300 meters short, or would they make it 300 meters and then collapse? Well, of course they'd make it an extra 300 meters because the mind creates the finish line, holds the body together until that moment, and then it collapses. So what do you do when you don't have a finish line? You just got to tell your mind, hold my body together indefinitely. And then overcome those disappointments where you come around a corner and your eyes see a cliff and your body goes, whoa, half an hour, this will be over. And then your eyes focus in the fog and you think, that's not a cliff, it's an iceberg. This is continuing to go on indefinitely. And that can be trained. And I trained specifically for resilience a lot in the build-up. Resilience is a kind of mental strength.
How did you train? I mean, it's a really interesting point. How do you train for resilience?
So resilience is a mental strength. All strengths can be trained. You want bigger muscles, you put them under stress, it rips, it's painful, it's sore for the next 2 days, and it grows back stronger. So, and if you want a bigger arm, you lift your weights with your arms. If you want bigger chest, you lift weights with your chest. You narrow it down. So how can you recreate the specific kinds of stress that you're looking for? So one thing I did was I went out rowing at 8 p.m. Just as it got dark. I was by myself and I rowed 2 kilometers backwards and forwards in just on the most boring loop you can possibly imagine. And I did that for 12 hours. And now the stresses that recreated were pushing yourself when you're bored, and also pushing yourself where the finish line doesn't get closer. Of course, it's impossible to manufacture not having a finish line. But, 12 hours would mean that no matter how fast or slow I went, I would be out there for the same amount of time. It wasn't like, right, we've got 10K to go, let's just get this down. So that trained me to just go where there was no sort of time benefit from going harder or slower. And equally, at night, there was nothing to stimulate myself. It was boring. I was by myself. And that particular night, it happened to be horrendous wind from the side, so it made it even more difficult. So I did have a goal in mind. I hoped to get over 100 kilometers, or I can't remember what it was. And I did a fraction of that. And whenever I landed a couple of times for a 10-minute break, and because of the wind, that became really difficult. So I'm dealing with all sorts of adversities. And even though I didn't hit my aim of 100 kilometers, I dealt with all those adversities. And then next time I'm in a situation where I'm like that, I actually was articulating to myself, I can outlast this. I've done it before. I've done it for 12 hours. I've done it for 24 hours on a running race or whatnot. I can indefinitely last because I've trained. It's not innate. I haven't woken up as an incredibly hard bastard. I'm I have a relatively soft upbringing, but I manufactured the right kind of stress. So whether the stress came, I could deal with it. I heard one guy describe it to me when I was interviewing those psychologists as resilience is like a vaccine. You expose yourself to a little bit of the stress. So when it comes in a full herd, you are immune. Other stresses, I did ultra marathons. My knee blew out. I completed 96 kilometers over 24 hours on hobbling on a knee. And that is, a bit more easy to articulate the stress I was going through and the stress I could overcome. It's something when on that night, I often thought about that knee, I've done 100 kilometers over mountains on a knee that won't work. I can paddle like this forever. So yeah, I would say be specific about the stress, and if you're worried about public speaking, you can do it to 10 people, then 50 people, then 100 people. If you're worried about anything, you can manufacture the stress in the same way, and then suddenly it's not so stressful.
I'm interested to understand, Mark, why you do it. What is your why?
Well, it's definitely changed. It used to be sort of I would probably say something generic the chance to push yourself, human endurance, find the edge, which were rather unsatisfactory answers for people listening and for me. And I think that's because I became a bit obsessed with the world record, the world first, the world record being in the Atlantic attempts, the world first here, and this sort of external goal of it. And I'd forgotten really that the reason I want to do it is twofold. Being immersed in nature and doing something like this immerses you utterly in nature, because not only are you surrounded to it, but you're also subject to it. if the ice said no, we couldn't go. Like, it's almost, you live by the rhythms. Like, if the wind is like this, it dictates it. You go on the tides, etc., etc. And in a kayak, you feel every nip and every bump in your kayak, and it really puts you in touch with the water around you, and you're moving under human power rather than motoring through it, so it makes you feel like an extension. And the second one is camaraderie. I mentioned before that I used to play rugby, and I think that is hugely informative to my approach to adventure, because it's such a committing sport. It produces a high level of camaraderie. And I see very much the same in this. I would never do it by myself. I want to do something committing with a shared goal. So that shared goal is still important. I said at the beginning, I became too obsessed with the outcome. But now the outcome is still important to me, but as a facilitator for those intrinsic values. And those intrinsic values are far more potent because they are more fulfilling, more lasting. And they also, ironically, make you more likely to achieve the outcome, because if you're just focused on some arbitrary place that you've crossed the line and you think that you've finished, that can feel very far away. But if you're focused on camaraderie, you can look your teammate in the eye at any moment and say, I'm pushing for them. And they feel much more real, even if the idea of camaraderie is abstract, than a finishing line, even though the finishing line is real.
Camaraderie is an important feature to much of what you've described. How is that approach to the importance, the emphasis that you place, if you like, on camaraderie? How has that sort of philosophy, if we can term it as such, influence your approach to, first and foremost, adventuring, but also life in general?
It's more than just like an emphasis. There's an outcome I specifically look for. I would say, what are my 3 goals on the Northwest Passage? To complete the Northwest Passage, to have an immersive experience in nature, and to have an experience of camaraderie. And I sometimes get asked in the end of my talks, if you are no longer motivated by the world record or world first, and you're motivated by camaraderie, do you find it harder to train, or do you find yourself training less because you think, well, if I'm not as fit as I am or I could be, and I don't finish, then so be it, because as long as I had an experience of camaraderie. But it actually informs me the other way, because as I said before, the camaraderie is going to be undermined if I turn up and I'm not pulling my weight. Friendship is a shared experience, but camaraderie is like overcoming something together, a shared goal. So with that in mind, I want to turn up as fit as possible. I want to be like a good, solid part of the team. I want to be somebody people can rely on. And I want to give everything, not just for the outcome, but for each other. And of course, you're going to start to be undermined. And on given days, I would struggle. It's not like I'm out there just like the Terminator. There was one day in particular where we were just chugging along over 4 miles an hour, going quickly, and then like everything came off a cliff. This was quite near the end. I could feel that cliff edge coming closer and closer in the days coming up, and I just utterly spiraled. I was just so out of energy. I was so hungry, and then mentally everything spiraled as well. And I was just, only 190 miles from the end and thinking, I'm never going to finish, whatnot. And when I say you've got to be a good part of the team for camaraderie, etc., like, it's not like you don't have to be 100% every day. And the camaraderie is almost built in those hard days. And everybody was very understanding of what I was going through and asked sensitive questions at the end of the day. They're like, how can we avoid that happening again? As we went into a place called Pierce Harbour. And from then on, I was really hanging on by my fingernails, but I never had such a catastrophe like that again. But so camaraderie informs me because it makes me want to be more prepared, because you don't want to let people down. Like, camaraderie is about relationships built on the shared goal. And first and foremost, you need to be pulling towards that task, so then you can have that shared camaraderie as you claw towards it. And it's a much more potent motivator to get fit. As for the rest of my life, say beyond that, I'd say part of the reason I go to these lengths is because it's difficult to replicate in real life. The other place I would have experienced it, I suppose, is rugby. And I've done maybe an ultramarathon with a group of people, and we haven't taken it especially seriously. We just wanted to finish and have a good time, and that's been fantastic. And I did have a good time, and what a fun shared experience. But it's not camaraderie. Camaraderie is overcoming some like shared obstacle, not just having a shared experience. So yeah, in real, I go to great lengths to search for this bond, And I'm happy to say that with Jeff West and Eileen, the Arctic Cowboys, I really feel like I have it.
Is it too simplistic to assume, therefore, that that's success for you? That's the success, if you like, is that it's this feeling. It's not a goal. It's not a finish line, but actually it's an experience that you've a shared common purpose, common goals. That's the success for you.
Yeah, well, that is why I now have 3 goals rather than just the simple one, because the extrinsic goal is binary, and you either succeed or you don't. And I felt so wretched when I failed in the Atlantic that I came to these intrinsic goals, because I suppose I'm diversifying my like portfolio of motivations to like de-risk the idea of failure. So I would have been gutted had we not finished. But as long as we had those other 2 experiences, I would have said it is a success to some degree, at least. And if we'd finished and I'd had a miserable experience and I absolutely hated the other 4, I wouldn't say, oh, wow, I'd love the Northwest Passage. I'd say, yeah, I mean, I guess it's good that we set these records and, sorry, not records, world first. So, but, it was a bit rubbish. But they all play into each other. And it's not as simple as just one's success and one's not. And that maybe we would have struggled to have that feeling of camaraderie if we hadn't finished, or at least like given it a good punch. But yeah, I mean, 89 miles from the end, that was the time where I really thought, actually, maybe we won't finish this, because there was no weather window and not enough food to wait out the weather. And I became incredibly outcome focused there. I was, flagellating like 89 miles from the end, and we've messed it up. So at points it was difficult not to become outcome focused. In fact, it was more difficult when we were so close, to fail so close, yet so far, kind of thing. But so yeah, I have a range of motivations and I draw on them all. The good thing about intrinsic motivations is it does allow you to judge success on your own terms. Had we not finished the Northwest Passage, you could say you've not finished, or you have finished. Had we not finished, only I can say whether I had that experience of camaraderie that I was looking for, and whether I've had that experience of immersion in nature that I was looking for. So it empowers you to judge success on your own terms. And that's another kind of resilience, If resilience is the ability to like overcome obstacles and deal with adversity, me being able to say what is a success and what is not a success on my own terms, that is a kind of, I basically can't fail, I suppose.
I think failure is an interesting word to debate, in so much as oftentimes I might simplify it by saying not having got in the kayak in the first place and literally put the oar in the water is the failure. That you clearly succeeded, but that world first to which you refer, but had you not gotten to the end, I'd still say you've still achieved an awful lot just by simply getting in the water. I'm interested to talk around this idea of failure, because I think it's been a real motivating factor for you, given some prior experiences where you'd set upon a very, clearly defined line goal, row across the Atlantic, for example, that you hadn't managed to achieve, and that had burned you, scarred you. Is that too strong a phrase? But it certainly had made its mark quite significantly. How?
Oh yeah, it burned me. I still live with that a little bit. I'm now like super, super content. I feel so zen after the Northwest Passage. Like I've got everything I ever dreamed of. It is exactly what I wanted and how I wanted it. But even then, every now and then, something can trigger me and I feel a bit like those failure feelings coming back up. And I know what you mean by like starting one of these things is a success. And, after the Atlantic, people kept on telling me that, most people wouldn't even get to the start or have the bravery to try something like this. But I get that, but it didn't do it for me. I didn't feel proud that I started. So that's why I needed these other 2 intrinsic motivations about the immersion in nature. And even though I look back on those failed Atlantic crossings, I think about being in swells for the first time, huge swells rolling up behind you. You're in the pitch dark of this valley between these 2 swells. And then in the next moment, you move onto the top of the next one. And the moon, when it's your only light, casts this shadow behind you, this grey, silvery light that you don't get when you're in the city. You don't get when there's clouds or anything. You need to work to a place like the Atlantic by your own power to really experience that. And I think, wow, they were amazing, amazing moments. And that is really what I was looking for all along. So even though I did fail, I can re-examine them. I can reframe them looking back. or the stars as well. They sit with me. So had I had these intrinsic motivations, had I had the skills and the language to articulate those intrinsic motivations to me at the time, I probably would have taken it less hard. But the idea that like, well, you're brave enough to start is true. And I commend anybody who takes one of these, but it didn't do it for me.
This may seem a trite question, Mark, but I think it's a pertinent one. Do you get scared? And if so, what scares you?
Yeah, well, I'm scared of wasps, but I did get scared in the Northwest Passage. But so there was times that were objectively scary, I guess, in the Northwest Passage where had things gone a different way that we might have died. A couple of scenarios that pop into my head in particular are like when we got caught in sea ice and we couldn't get back to shore, and it was swirling around us and really dynamic. It was spilling over itself and crunching around us like lava. And we took a rest in this big open water between these two big ice floes, and they just changed direction and began to slowly come towards us. And just with an irresistible force, tons and tons of ice just crashed into the side of Eileen and my kayak. And, in that second, we could have been crushed to dust, but it pinched us. And the bottom of the kayak, because it's round, it got pinched and lifted up into the air. Had we been 1 kilogram heavier, had a bit more water on board, or taken more food, or leant to the left or the right, instinctively put out our arm, anything like that, maybe we would have been crushed to death. But even so, like in those moments, you don't think about it because you're reacting. And, I guess you could become overwhelmed. And then what would you do next? And had you taken me, age 19, and just put me in that situation, I might have been, but I'd done lots up until that point, and that might be one of the worst moments. But it's not like I haven't gone from 0 to 100. So I reacted. We pulled ourselves forward, got back into the water. I leapt out of the kayak. I pulled Eileen and I's kayak onto the ice. Then I turned around, and Jeff and Wes had been hit, and they were slowly rotating. And Jeff, being the most chilled Texan man you'll ever meet, was as he was so slowly being submerged into his icy death, was saying, "Oh, yo, Mark, we're going to need your help here real quick." So I pull them out, and you just do it. And then later, hours later, when we're finally free and sitting on the shore and having a cup of tea, then I think, wow, we almost died, and I have a daughter at home. That was the moment I wrote in my diary. I've never felt so important that I get home. And we had other moments like that. But then when I was scared was when something was developing more slowly and you had much more time to contemplate it. Of the many polar bears that we saw, there was one that was plodding towards us, just going along the shore. It wasn't coming for us. We happened to be on his route or her route. She was with a cub. And Eileen and I started waving, and we got towels out to wave to make ourselves look bigger. And it popped its head up, looked at us, acknowledged us. It definitely knew we were there. And every other polar bear up until that point had been scared and had run in the opposite direction. But this one, shrugged. I'll just keep going. And it wasn't threatening to us. It wasn't coming for us. It probably would have wanted to just wander past us. But, it's happening so slowly over like a matter of minutes. It's just getting closer and closer and closer. And thinking, we haven't at this moment fired a flare or fired a shotgun into the air or anything like that, which might have done the job. But you are beginning to think like, what if this doesn't turn around? And those are the moments when I got scared. And eventually Eileen and I sort of made a sprint towards it, just like over 5 or 6 meters, just like a sharp, fast movement in its direction. And that gave it food for thought. And it went into the water and it swam out to sea around us, either getting onto the ice or maybe getting back onto the land further down from us. And polar bears, I was definitely the most paranoid of polar bears. The Americans are used to camping with all sorts of apex predators. I just camp with urban foxes and the like in the UK. But nonetheless, the contrast between those two experiences was that one time you're reacting and the other time you're sitting there and thinking and analyzing the various outcomes rather than just dealing with the one that you're going for. So time to think is definitely something that can produce fear.
You made mention of your daughter. Was there ever a point at which you contemplated quitting, given that to your point, your daughter and your son, you've got children you've got to get home. Was there a point you think, actually, this is daft, right? They need me there. They need me at home as their dad. I've got to. The sensible option is I've got to go home.
No, I never thought about quitting. I thought I would do anything to get to the end. Absolutely anything.
No, my immediate thought was I almost said quitting was not an option. I get that. I can see that. It comes through. But I still feel like I'd wanted to ask the question as to whether or not actually you
Yeah, I know what you
contemplated.
mean. And like, I feel selfish almost saying it, like, or, maybe a better father would have at least like entertained the idea of like, what are the consequences for the people around me? I mean, the whole thing is selfish. I feel like when you get into that degree of selfishness, there's like no turning back. Yeah, so it's like almost like I was in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm here. I'm going to do it. I almost thought it would be more insulting sometimes to not give everything, like the sacrifices that my wife had made and other people had made to allow me to be here. And to quit would almost be, I was like, I'm going to eat. No, I'm not just that I'm about quitting. I also thought about enjoying it. I'm going to enjoy this. Like, imagine the selfishness if I come home and they say, how was leaving me as a single parent for 4 months and making me do everything on my own? And I'd say, bit miserable. Like, I was like, I have to enjoy this, come hell or high water. So quitting or not enjoying it, like towards the end, like when you're so depleted, it's easier to let external things annoy you. And like, there were days when I was short. But in the beginning, I kept on saying that nobody or nothing is going to stop me enjoying this.
It's interesting. We touched on, you've certainly talked about clearly camaraderie is a common theme. The experiences of being with West, Jeff, and Eileen, and the teamwork, and all of we could apply all sorts of cliches, couldn't we, liberally? But actually, the thing that strikes me is the team, the overarching team that is required in order for things like this to take place. Not least of which the role of your wife, who, I can only imagine is incredibly supportive and in and of herself, incredibly resilient, incredibly tough, a great example, I'd imagine, to contribute to the successes that you've enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, what she did, which was looking after a 1-year-old, 7 months pregnant, her company went insolvent in the middle of the Northwest Passage. So then at 7 months pregnant, had to find another job. She should be giving motivational talks. Like what she did is, and I'm not just saying this to be sort of faux modest, it really is as difficult. I couldn't imagine doing that. And part of my talks, there's the 3 C's of resilience that psychologists say, which control. Resilient people focus on what they can control. Commitment, you're more likely to be resilient when you're doing something that you're committed to. Challenge, you view obstacles not as difficult things, but things that are challenges that you can rise to. But I think they're missing a 4th C, and that is community. It is easier to do hard things when you have a community around you who is supporting you. And that is a 4th missing C. Whether it is like literally supporting you in this sense, like taking on the responsibilities that I left behind, or whether it is, just like some positive people around you saying like, don't give up, or even being harsher, don't chicken out kind of thing, like tough love if you need it. And the 4th C I'd add to those 3 C's of resilience is community. And I'm blessed by one that has spider webs long and far. It's my wife looking after one kid required probably more help from my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, and from my parents, and from her friends, and like it's endless. The amount of people who are required to like indirectly support me.
So, what drives you?
Well, I guess the drive, that's a good way of phrasing it, because in one way that could be the same question as why do I do it, and that's the 3 motivations I said before. But what drives me is probably like a unhealthy existential dread that we're running out of time, and we're all going to be old soon, and you don't go through life like shedding responsibilities. This is a wrong time in my life. Well, in 5 years' time, it's going to be the even more wrong time in your life, and that time is just marching on. So I am filled with some existential dread that I've got to be doing something interesting all the time now. And even if I go on like a holiday where we sit by the pool, I don't come back more relaxed. I might come back physically less tired than if I went camping for a week, but I'm filled with anxiety that I've just like of my rare time off, the limited resources I have to spend time and money doing what I want, and I've just wasted a week by the pool, and I come back feeling dreadful. So it would be nice if maybe I was able to just chill out a little bit more. I'm not, I guess, but yeah, that drives me. And that existential dread is disappearing a little bit because now, like, I can relax with my children, and that is a fulfilling experience. Playing in the pool with my kids is amazing and fulfilling in a different way. So maybe I'll go on a summer holiday. It's a bit more relaxed soon.
So you can reframe it. You can reposition. You can frame it in such a way that actually that week, to your point, it's fulfilling, it's rewarding, it's enhancing everybody's well-being and lives by spending that time with your kids. It's important, right? You can reframe it in that way.
Yeah, well, I'm a relatively new father, so like until I had kids, then no, like I couldn't say, I'm spending time with my wife or whatever. Like I would have said to my wife, okay, this is fine, but can we go hiking? I'd rather share the experience of hiking than in a pool. And we usually end up compromising and have some kind of hiking holiday with a few days of like luxury at the end. And my wife is like, we say she's a hardy hiker, fit and stuff, enjoys that kind of things outdoors. So we certainly did a lot of that. But now that I have kids, every moment playing with them, being a father is, I just was looking forward to it. And even with that in mind, it is like far surpassed my expectations on just like how joyous it is. So yeah, now that I have kids, I can probably go and spend a week with them and be like, just, this is time away from work with them, dedicated to them. And I basically never, I went to New Zealand with Naomi last year, but I've never had like a relaxing holiday with them. But we have one in April coming up. We're just going to a place in Scotland and just going to do nothing but play with the kids, and that's going to be amazing.
I read that you've the concept of stay ventures that I think is fascinating. How you balance the allure of the sort of distant, almost romantic, and I know the reality is they're brutally harsh, some of these things that you're undertaking, but there's almost an element of romance, of this allure of the distant expedition, and how you balance that off with the rewards of the local adventure. I'm fascinated as to how do you balance that off? How do you play with that sense of actually I'm as much enriched and rewarded by a hike in my local forest or a walk around my local park as I am by kayaking the Northwest Passage?
Well, first and foremost, you talk about the romance, and I do have quite a romantic notion of adventure and wilderness, which sets it up and potentially to fail, but it never does. I see view like, and I want to be in it in quite a visceral way that perhaps is romantic. And I talk about stay ventures a lot on my website. I'm writing a book at the moment called Stay Ventures. But what you've described, I guess, would be maybe a micro venture. And most people say to me when I talk about stay ventures, oh, isn't that the same as what Al Humphreys does, a micro venture? And he's a great author, adventurer, and advocate for the outdoors. And so many people have got into the outdoors through his micro adventures. But I want to dispel the idea that it can be micro and at home or big and abroad. Why can't it be big and at home? So am I as fulfilled by a mountain hike as I am by a 3-month expedition to the Arctic? Well, probably not. But I could, without leaving the UK, kayak the whole way around the British mainland. And that would, in miles, literally be further than the Northwest Passage. Or I could kayak around Skye, or I could walk from Land's End to John O'Groats, or I could ride a horse from Land's End to John O'Groats, or I could learn to paddleboard and paddleboard the length of Loch Lomond. It could be 5 days or 10 days or 6 months. The UK is not limited at all. And microventures are great, but I am motivated by like big goals. And stay ventures, there's nothing like about them that is actually smaller. I guess it's less remote.
Do you think it's because we don't, that's a broad sweeping statement for which I can only apologize for the generalization, but we find it harder maybe to romanticize the familiar. So there's sort of the romance that comes from far-flung places, that sort of the wanderlust and the travel element to it that in itself becomes quite romantic. Whereas to your point, you think, well, but I live in Britain, walking John O'Groats to Land's End as a romantic notion, as opposed to the physical nature of the challenge. But I know what the UK, it feels familiar, so therefore it's less romantic.
Yeah, well, maybe it's because I went away for all of my 20s and lived in Hong Kong, but I began to view the UK through a different perspective. But, I realised that it's actually not familiar, and
no, I think you're right. I think if were anyone to do it, they'd be flabbergasted by the diversity of landscape they'd experience along the way.
Yeah, like what?
But actually,
Who's been to
but
Shetland?
mentally, it's kind of like, but we live here. I know
Yeah,
it.
I moved to London when I came back from Hong Kong. I'm from Edinburgh, so I haven't spent that much time in London. And when I come to London, I do the touristy stuff, or I see my friends. I've never considered the North Down and the South Down way, 100 miles each, varied through forests, ending up on chalky cliffs. Like, it's not familiar to me. I've not been to that part of the world. I've spent so little time in Wales. I went to hiking in Wales recently, and I was like, I thought it was going to be that Scottish Highlands diet, but it's different. There's way more ridges, and the sea is much closer. Well, obviously the sea's close to some parts of the island, but like it felt like very, very different. And Cornwall, I went kayaking there twice as training for the Northwest Passage. I was on the same beach like twice, and I hardly explored it. The Lake District, the Peak District, it's not familiar to me. And it's so varied. The west coast of Scotland is like world-class bucket list kayaking territory and hiking and anything really. And I've just done a fraction of it. So and it's less accessible as well. If you want to go to a place called Acadebui near like the Summer Isles, you're going to find it a much longer journey than if you want to go to Paris or Nice. So it's about like realizing that actually it's not just like viewing it through a new perspective and being philosophical about it. It's literally unfamiliar to me. And I spoke to one guy who's featuring in the Stay Venture book who walked from Land's End to John O'Groats. And I asked him the question along the lines of like, has this made you realize how small the UK is? You walked the length of it and now you think you've done it? And he said, no, it made me think that it's bigger. As I was passing the West Coast, I was thinking, look at that, I can't go there because I need to get to John O'Groats. I can't get there. Or what about there? And then I was at John O'Groats, I was looking at Orkney, and then I was thinking of Shetland, and it gave him the complete opposite to like a counterintuitive like reaction. It was not, I walked it must be tiny. It was like I passed it by bits, and it's just infinite. And it is amazing. I mean, I've been to the Summer Isles and the Shetland and Jersey. And kayaked from Land's End to Summer Isles, or sailed to Shetland. Like, they are different worlds.
Well, I think I'm right in saying, aren't the Shetland Islands closer to Greenland?
Maybe Norway.
Than they are to
Norway, maybe.
Norway, closer to Norway than they are to the coast of Scotland, something like that?
Maybe, yeah. I don't think they're that far. It depends. One of the Shetland Islands is called Fair Isle, and that's basically very close to Orkney. So I don't know, but I know somebody who's kayaked from Shetland to Norway.
I think we sort of contextualise it, don't we, in the sense that I think I'm right in saying that you can't, you could fit the British Isles in Florida. So sometimes we get this sense of we're just a really small island. But actually there is a vastness to it. I'm struck by, as you're talking, I went with my fortunate or unfortunate, whichever way you look at it. I was at Murrayfield for the recent
I was there
Scotland
too.
England
Yes,
International.
I'm Scottish. I would like to let's talk about this some more.
I didn't think you'd mind talking about this, but I went with my three oldest pals. So we grew up in the New Forest, and we decided this time one of my friends is a rugby coach, so we were always very fortunate to be able to enjoy a ticket to at least one Six Nations or an also international. And the last couple of years, rather than go to Twickenham, we decided we're going to go away and make a bit of an adventure and a weekend of it. So Cardiff last year, Murrayfield this, and we decided we'd drive and make a road trip of it rather than fly, which we could have done, but we just said, no, why don't we drive up? Have some fun. So we went up and we came up from the south coast of England. And as you're talking about this sense of a stay venture, the thing that absolutely struck me as we went through the Peak District, through the Lake District, into, past, we got into all sorts of topics about Gretna Green, but as we going into Scotland, and we kept coming up with, we were laughing at the different words we were using to describe the beauty, the bleakness, the vastness of the landscape. It's just like it's going into a different world. And actually you see that on this very small island to which we refer. So I think, to your point, there is so much that can be gained. And adventure, people, I think I had a fascinating guy on the podcast, Daryl. His business is Primal Play. So he's got a fascinating background, but he's using exercise. He's using the concept of play and exercise to tackle issues like obesity. And we talked about how, he asked me a question once. When was the last time you ran for a bus? So I don't know, I can't really remember. He said, when was the last time you ran for a bus on purpose to try and beat the bus? I said, oh, crikey, probably when I was about 10 years old. I said, yeah, we used to do that stuff all the time. When we were kids, we'd play games with ourselves all the time. We're always outdoors. We've got this sense of adventure. And it would appear to have been lost generationally. We're so fearful. Kids don't play outside anymore.
Yeah. Like our sphere of independence as kids is shrinking.
And the comment was made, the dangers that are around for kids today were just as prevalent when we were kids. There aren't more bad people. We just hear about them more, but there aren't more bad people. But yet we're more fearful of them. So we as adults, we're crushing our children's sense of adventure. I guess it's a topic I wasn't necessarily going down the route of.
I think of it
today,
as short and long-term danger parenting. You can take them out of the risk or the danger in the short term, and then in the long term, they might end up in more danger because they don't have the confidence, the wherefore, etc., to deal with it in real life, whether that's abstract like confidence or literal. Like you stop them climbing as toddlers, and one day they have to climb. And they don't know how, or more like abstract, they have the confidence to believe in themselves and go for something. So in the short term, you can mitigate their risks, and in the long term, you increase them, or in the short term, you can allow them to do risks under your supervision in a way that's doing dangerous stuff carefully, and empower them in the long term. And there's obviously a balance. I'm not going to just give my kid a machete and tell them to go hunt food, but there's and sometimes I see them climbing stuff, and I'm like, that's too much, or being 20 months old, I hold their hand as they bounce along the log. I'm not just going to say, go for it, here's a log, do a backflip, but there's a risk appetite. And I'm not a psychopath. Like when they are doing risky stuff and I'm letting them do it, I have my heart in my mouth, thinking like, please don't fall, at least not on my watch. There's I particularly to myself before I don't share it, because I think usually because it makes me sound like some kind of parenting influencer, like insufferable, like long-term, short-term parenting. But I often think to myself, short-term pain, long-term gain, kind of parenting approach.
I think you're right. Parenting is a uniquely personal decision. I'm not casting aspersions on anyone's parent, but I just wonder as to how you choose to raise your kids is an individual thing. But I just think as to that sort of spirit of adventure, it strikes me that we're inherently adventurous by nature in varying degrees. It manifests in different ways for different people, but spending hours playing in the woods, climbing trees as a kid, which sounds like a little bit like, well, there's a really romantic notion of a Britain that's long disappeared. But actually, that's what we did. And actually, there was a sense of adventure that came with it. We were creative. We played our own games. We didn't need to be entertained. There was never a question.
I'm sure the generations above you and I were saying, kids these days don't play like they used to. Like there's a degree of that as well. There's like a famous quote from like Socrates or something where he's talking about how this generation has never had it easier and all the technology is making them soft, and these thousands of years ago. And another one where when books first started to be printed like en masse, the idea that they were wasting their time indoors reading and they're not getting outdoors like they used to. And you could replace the word PlayStation for books in those sentences. But now we're like, I wish my kid read more,
It's a really good point. And I'm very conscious I'm at that point at which I am the accusation old man shouting at clouds is one that certainly could apply. But, I do think this sense of adventure that you impart and you inspire, frankly, it isn't just a romantic notion, but actually there's a really important kind of health and well-being message to it, which I know is not something you're trying to espouse, but I do think it needs to be acknowledged.
I do try and espouse it from a mental health perspective.
Yeah.
After the Atlantic rose, I struggled. So, and I raised money for a mental health charity that gets people into the outdoors called Wilderness Foundation, and I raised over £15,000 for them in the Northwest Passage. So it is something I do articulate, but I'm sure my kids will not be inspired by me until they're 30. Like, I just think.
I think you'd be surprised. Yeah. I think you would be surprised.
No, they will until they're 10, and then they'll turn off me, and then they'll think again later when they're adults. Like, maybe what he did was quite cool.
You mentioned I wanted to ask you about Wilderness Foundation UK. You've raised thousands for them to which you refer, and I think that absolutely evidences that part of who you are and what you do is you've a remarkable commitment to giving back, not only in terms of the money that you've raised, but also the message that you share. And how do you choose the causes you support, and why is that important to you?
I chose Wilderness Foundation because like the narrative sort of fit with my experience. After the Atlantic, one of the ways I got myself back on my feet was getting into the wilderness, hiking or more structured trail running. Trail running was a real blessing because I'm absolutely terrible at it. So there was like no way that I could kid myself, oh, I'm going to set the world record like I had in the Atlantic, and then I wouldn't come with this albatross around my neck about achieving or not achieving. I could set my own goal, or I could just do it and finish as quickly as I could. But either way, it's just easy for me. Like I've done it my whole life, hiking every Sunday with my dad. My dad and I would go away to a place called the Loch Ken Adventure Centre, which I think still exists, on holiday, just the two of us, when I was like very young. So yeah, I mean, I'd just say, I feel rubbish. This is an easy thing for me to do. It's less easy for other people because they don't have the background, the role models, the access. Maybe they feel like they don't fit in. I can't speak for different communities, but I know that it's easy for me, and I know it's not so easy for others. So the Wilderness Foundation made exact sense in terms of what I was trying to espouse, because it was doing what I did for people who maybe don't find it as easy as I did.
So what next? Well,
for one, I feel very content for now. So I'm not like itching to do something massive, but it would be in the UK, like the Stay Venture thing. It's something that really motivates me. There's stuff on my bucket list. I'd like to kayak from Inverness through the Caledonia Canal, then back over the top to Inverness. So it's like a circle on the top of Britain. I think they call it the roof of Britain. I'd love to do the North Down Way, but maybe over a series of weekends rather than 100 miles in one go. I aim to I will move back up to Edinburgh sooner or later. And I want to do the whole North Down Way before I leave London. And I'd like to do the whole Cape Wrath Trail. I did half of the Cape Wrath Trail when I was 20, but I'm trying to think of something that's less structured. Something that interests me now in terms of conceptualizing adventure is the ingredient of your imagination. You could cycle from Land's End to Donegg Roads, cool, but how can you use your imagination to make it different or more unique without becoming gimmicky? I could cycle from Land's End to Donegg Roads and do a Rubik's Cube every day. Like, it wouldn't be relevant. But, I kayaked down the west coast of Scotland a couple of years ago and stopped at every Munro I passed and hiked up each of the Munros, mountains in Scotland over 3,000 foot. That was an imaginative way to combine two things I love and forced me to approach adventure from a different point of view. The guidebooks have parking lots on the other side, so there's nothing on the seaside. I've got to work a route out. Like, it immerses you in a different way by thinking of it imaginatively. And the Stay Venture book that I was talking about is such a core part of it, is imagination. When they're doing it, how they're doing it, the constraints they're putting on themselves. One guy set himself the target of traveling home from university by foot for less than the cost of a train ticket. Or one person found where the Grand Meridian, latitude line was, and or longitude line. You'd think I'd know the difference. And tried to stick to that, walking the whole way up, which forced her to go through different places. So I feel like imagination in the UK, but I haven't imagined anything specific yet. But yeah, so I could continue to work on that Stay Venture book, but I have the Northwest Passage book called There Will Be Headwinds coming out as well. Got a publisher a couple of weeks ago. So I'm
fantastic,
digging my teeth into that. And in a bookshelf near you. I don't know when or where it'll be out, sometime in 2025. So those are all the different things. But for now, I'd like to go hiking more with the kids in the hiking rucksack, and I'm trying to build them up to get used to going further.
So where should we point listeners to find out more, Mark?
So I've got social media, Twitter and Instagram @AdventureAgnew. Or you can go to my website, adventureagnew.com, where you'll also find a contact form and an email if you wanted to reach out and ask more questions. Then you're welcome to. Those are the two places where I'll be sharing pictures of the Northwest Passage, which I'm still dribbling out to people, and more information about books when they come out. And feel free to reach out. Always happy to answer questions.
Mark, thank you. It's a fascinating tale that you share, but I think equally as important, the lessons that you've learned and continue to learn from it. I think there's much from which so many of us can take away. So really appreciate you taking the time out to come and share your your story with us. Your story so far, I think, is how I want to phrase it. Not least, there's much by way of adventure ahead. I think life is just, the truth is life is an adventure, right? Make of it as you will. But I think there's clearly much more to come. And I look forward to seeing what next. I look forward to the book. It sounds fascinating. I love to read, so you can be sure I shall be ordering a copy when that's out. But really appreciate you taking the time out today. And I wish you every success with whatever it might be that comes next.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us on Extrology today. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed today's episode, to jump onto Apple Podcast or indeed any of your podcast listening channels of choice to leave us a review. Check us out on our socials, Instagram, Facebook, Extrology. Come find us at extrology.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. Really appreciate, as always, your ears, time and attention, and look forward to catching up with you next time. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.